Well, look at that. This is the moment it finally lands. You can see it in their eyes first. That brief flicker. The pause that wasn't there before. The subtle shift in tone when they realize something they avoided for far too long is now standing right in front of them, fully formed, impossible to ignore. They see it now. Not all of it. Not yet, but enough. Enough to understand they made a very expensive mistake when they decided you were small. They thought you were easy to read, easy to manage, easy to reposition like furniture in a room they assumed belonged to them. They mistook your quiet for emptiness, your patience for fear, your kindness for a lack of backbone. They assumed that because you didn't react the way they would, because you didn't shout, threaten, or perform outrage, you must not have noticed. They thought awareness looked loud. They were wrong. What they never understood is that while they were busy talking, you were watching. While they were asserting, you were absorbing. While they were filling the space with their certainty, you were studying the structure of the room itself. You weren't frozen, you weren't lost, you weren't confused, you were tracking patterns. You noticed how their words shifted depending on the audience, how their behavior changed the moment control felt threatened, how their kindness came with conditions, how respect vanished the second they believed they had leverage. You saw how quickly concern turned into judgment, how easily narratives replaced conversations. They called you passive because it made them feel powerful. They called you harmless because it made them feel safe. They called you nothing special because it protected their illusion of superiority, and you let them believe it, not because you couldn't correct them, but because correcting them would have taught them something too early. Silence was never surrender, it was restraint. It was distance. It was you refusing to hand your energy to people who would only use it to sharpen themselves against you. While they assumed you were standing still, you were moving internally, reorganizing, letting old instincts fall away, unlearning the reflex to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. They don't like this part. This is where their story starts to wobble. Because now they're replaying moments, conversations, decisions. They're remembering how often you didn't defend yourself, how you let accusations hang in the air without grabbing at them, how you walked away from situations they expected you to beg to stay in. And suddenly, it doesn't look like weakness anymore. It looks like choice. They're beginning to realize you weren't waiting for permission. You were waiting for clarity. And once you had it, once the picture sharpened, you stopped negotiating with people who were never negotiating in good faith. You didn't announce the change. You didn't threaten. You didn't give speeches. You simply withdrew access. You stopped feeding dynamics that relied on your confusion. You stopped showing up to emotional negotiations, where you always paid the cost. And that's when things quietly started unraveling for them. Because control only works when the other person stays reachable. They tried to pull you back with familiarity, with nostalgia, with half acknowledgments and selective amnesia. They acted like nothing happened. Because in that version of reality, they still had influence. But something in you had already shifted. You weren't angry. You weren't plotting revenge. You were finished participating. That's the part they never prepare for. They know how to handle resistance. They know how to manage conflict. They even know how to spin outrage into proof of instability. What they don't know how to survive is indifference rooted in self-respect. Because when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining, when you stop seeking validation from people who benefited from your doubt, the entire structure collapses. There's nothing left to push against, no emotional handles, no predictable buttons, just space. And space is terrifying to people who rely on proximity to feel powerful. They're realizing now that you were never dependent on them the way they assumed, that withholding attention didn't starve you, that rationed approval didn't define you. In fact, the moment you stopped reaching for it, you became lighter, clearer, untouchable in the ways that matter. They're watching you move on without ceremony. No announcement, no dramatic exit, just a quiet reorientation toward a life that doesn't revolve around proving anything to anyone who already decided who you were. And that's when regret begins to creep in. Not the clean kind, not the honest kind, the restless kind, the irritated kind, the kind that arrives quietly, the kind that arrives quietly, the kind that arrives quietly, the kind that doesn't get already, the kind of that realization. They feel it now in the small moments, the ones they can't explain away, when they talk and you don't lean in, when they test old dynamics and get nothing back, when their presence, no longer shifts your mood or pulls your attention. That's when it hits them. Access to you was a privilege they treated like a guarantee. You didn't become cold. You became precise. You didn't harden, you clarified. You learned that not everything deserves a response, and not everyone deserves proximity. That discernment isn't cruelty. That boundaries don't need footnotes for people who only ask so they can cross them more efficiently. While they were busy maintaining appearances, you were building substance. While they invested in control, you invested in autonomy. While they obsessed over narratives, you stepped out of them entirely. From the outside, it looks effortless. That's what confuses them most. They don't see the nights you dismantled your own beliefs, the moments you wondered if you were the problem, the internal work it took to stop chasing understanding from people who thrived on withholding it. They only see the result, the calm, the distance, the way you no longer orbit their approval. And that absence lands like a slow ache. Some of them are irritated, some are confused. Some carry a quiet shame they'll never name, but all of them feel the shift. The realization that whatever power they thought they had over you is gone, not taken, not fought for, just rendered irrelevant. You didn't expose them. You didn't need to. Their behavior collapses under its own weight when there's no one left to absorb it. You didn't demand justice. You chose alignment instead. And alignment has a way of rearranging everything without raising its voice. They may still talk. They may still try to define you from a distance, but it doesn't land the same anymore because you're no longer available to be shaped by opinions rooted in insecurity or entitlement. You outgrew the room without flipping the table. That's what they're sitting with now. The realization that you were never playing the same game. That while they were focused on winning, you were focused on leaving. That while they were trying to dominate the space, you were quietly building a life that doesn't require their participation. And the most unsettling part for them? You didn't leave angry. You left clear. Clear about what you deserve. Clear about what you deserve. Clear about what you tolerate. Clear about the cost of staying in places that require you to shrink to belong. You didn't burn bridges. You simply stopped crossing them. They feel the absence now, not because you announced it, but because it's undeniable. The energy you used to bring, the patience you used to offer, the emotional labor you once gave freely. It's gone, reclaimed, redirected. You're already somewhere else, mentally building something quieter, steadier, more honest. And they're just now realizing that the version of you they thought they understood doesn't exist anymore. This isn't revenge. This isn't dominance. It's consequence without confrontation. And it shows up in the quiet moments, when there's no audience to perform for, when the noise fades and the truth has room to breathe. That's when it hits hardest. You didn't just walk away from them, you outgrew the entire version of reality where they mattered. And that loss, they don't know how to process it, because people like that are used to being the reference point, used to being the center others adjust around, used to their moods shaping rooms and their approval shaping behavior. They don't know what to do when someone exits the gravitational field entirely. You didn't argue your way out. You didn't fight your way free. You didn't even explain. You simply stopped orienting your life around their expectations. That's what broke the spell. They're replaying your last interactions now with a different lens. The moments they brushed past, the boundaries they ignored, the times they assumed you'd always return, always bend, always forgive without change. They see it now, the subtle withdrawal, the quiet reallocation of energy, the way you were conserving yourself while they weren't paying attention. They missed the shift because they only noticed what served them. Now they're left with questions that don't have satisfying answers. Why didn't you react? Why didn't you chase closure? Why didn't you demand accountability the way they expected? Because you learned something they haven't yet. Closure doesn't come from conversations with people who benefit from your confusion. Accountability doesn't require your participation when patterns speak louder than words. And the strongest move is not proving your worth to people who already showed you how they value it. They mistook silence for ignorance. They mistook patience for tolerance. They mistook understanding for endless excuse. What they never realized is this: understanding doesn't mean staying. And once you see clearly, leaving becomes inevitable. They're noticing it more now, the distance. Not the dramatic kind, not a slammed door or a public break, but something far more unsettling. Your absence has weight. The rooms feel louder without you absorbing tension. Conversations feel sharper without you smoothing edges. The dynamics that once relied on your restraint now wobble without a stabilizer. You used to be the buffer, the translator, the one who carried the emotional load quietly so everyone else could stay comfortable. They didn't value it because they thought it was endless. It wasn't. You didn't harden. You refined your limits. You didn't detach because you stopped caring, you detached. Because you started caring correctly. There's a difference, and they're only just beginning to feel it. When they think of you now, it comes with an unfamiliar mix of admiration and discomfort. They can't reduce you to the old narratives anymore. You didn't collapse the way they expected. You didn't need saving or vindication. You moved on intact. That's deeply unsettling to people who rely on others breaking to justify their own behavior. They're starting to sense what they missed all along. You were never fragile, you were discerning. And once discernment replaces hope, the dynamic changes permanently. Hope waits, discernment decides. You decided. There's a part of them that won't admit it, but it's there, a quiet envy, not of your success or your calm, but of your freedom. The way you no longer flinch, the way you don't over-explain, the way you don't over-explain, the way you trust your own read of situations without polling the room. They're still negotiating perceptions, still managing impressions, still editing themselves for control. You're not. You don't need to win narratives anymore because you're no longer living inside them. You stepped out of the story they were trying to write for you and started authoring something quieter, sturdier, more aligned. They can feel that you're unavailable for the roles they once assigned, you the fixer, the forgiver, the one who stays when it's uncomfortable, the one who absorbs impact so others don't have to. You resigned from those roles without notice, and now the system feels your absence. They may try to reconnect, not because they truly understand, but because they feel the loss of control. They may reach out with softened language, selective memory, sudden insight, not because they've changed, but because you have. And when that happens, you'll notice something surprising. You won't feel pulled. You won't feel flattered. You won't feel obligated. You'll feel neutral. And neutrality, when it's rooted in self-respect, doesn't reverse. You see them clearly now, without resentment, without longing. You recognize the patterns without needing to confront them. You understand the dynamics without needing to explain them. That's the power shift, not revenge, not dominance. Not exposure, independence. They're still processing the fact that they no longer get to define you, that their opinions don't steer your choices, that their approval doesn't unlock access, that whatever authority they assumed they had evaporated the moment you stopped participating, and you didn't replace them with bitterness, you replaced them with alignment. Your life feels different, now quieter, more intentional, less crowded by people who only show up when they need something from you. You don't perform understanding anymore. You practice discernment. You don't rush decisions. You don't rush decisions. You don't chase explanations. You don't volunteer access. You choose. And choice, exercise consistently, rewires everything. They'll continue to feel the consequences, not because you're punishing them, but because they're finally living without the buffer of your patience, without the safety net of your empathy, without the assumption that you'll always make space. You were never too much. You were just giving too much to the wrong places. Now you're selective, and selection is power. This isn't the end of the story. It's not even the climax. It's the quiet middle where things rearrange themselves without noise, where you keep moving forward without looking back or waiting for recognition. They're catching up to a realization you reached long ago. Some people don't lose you loudly. They lose you gradually, silently, permanently. And by the time they understand what happened, you're already somewhere else grounded, steady, no longer explainable to people who never took the time to understand you when they had the chance. This isn't an ending, it's a departure point. And you're not done yet.